Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and for sticking around for the show. And thanks for joining us in this conversation about supporting places and people as climate impacts drive population movement in Louisiana. My name is Joni Hammonds, and I'm a landscape architect and a planner at the Center for Planning Excellence. We're a nonprofit planning organization in Louisiana, based in Baton Rouge. And it's a pleasure to be moderating the panel today. As Omar mentioned, there's an audience in person and one virtually. So I encourage you all to think about questions. We'll have each of our presenters speak for 10 to 20 minutes and then have some time for questions. So have your thinking caps on as we are going through these. So the question is, what does it mean to support places and people as climate impacts drive population movement? Who is supporting and who is being supported? And supporting place really distinct from supporting people? Can we do both? And if so, how? Migration is really complex, as I'm sure you have heard over and over again in this conference. And so this conversation about migration and managed retreat can be really overwhelming, whether it's happening, at the household scale, at the community scale, or at the regional scale. Especially when we think about the fact that people move for so many reasons, and exposure to environmental hazards is one of that subset of reasons, but people also move for new job opportunities and to be closer to their family and to find better schools for their children. And then on the other hand, people choose to stay for just as many reasons. So this panel seeks to explore some of those drivers of migration in hopes that a better understanding of those drivers will help identify some fruitful paths forward. And our places in Louisiana, as everywhere, our places are so tightly woven together with our identity and our heritage that the decision to leave a place or to stay in a place can really disrupt families and communities. And so these are really hard conversations. Again, I'm sure this is news to none of you in the room. But it's also a conversation that is happening in this community of practitioners and academics and activists that are really trying to build a vocabulary to engage in that conversation. So as we share our work in this area and build strategies and tools to facilitate migration, it's clear to me, and I'm sure most of you, that these efforts really have to be firmly founded in practices of listening and hearing the people who are most affected. So our panel will ground this very big, very complex challenge in a very particular place, and that place is coastal Louisiana. Our speakers bring to this conversation distinct perspectives that highlight the complexity of planning for climate migration in Louisiana communities, present a path toward community-driven planning processes and what those might look like, showcase lived experience in these communities, and then also frame the conversation in a context of statewide migration. So speaking of our presenters, we have Kim Marisek, who is the Director of Planning at CPEX, where she works to drive change by lifting community values and needs through a comprehensive planning process to inform local decision-making. She has 29 years of planning experience and has worked both for and with local governments. She also worked as the Director of Planning for the Capital Region Planning Commission, the Director of Planning for St. Charles Parish, and was a community planner in Washington State for 13 years before moving to Louisiana. Elder Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar is the former active traditional tribal chief of the Grand Caillou Dulac band of Biloxi-Chitimacha-Choctaw, an ordained minister of the Universal Life Church, and an independent artist and small business owner. She is a founding member of the First Peoples Conservation Council of Louisiana and was elected the first Native American chairwoman of the Louisiana Governor's Office of Indian Affairs Native American Commission. Much of her work is dedicated to tribal federal acknowledgement efforts and serving her tribal citizens as the community residents within her tribal territory in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. Robert Havens is the economist at the Data Center of Southeast Louisiana, where he is a subject matter expert on data and analysis and leads several applied research projects, mostly focused on the economy of the New Orleans region, its workers and critical industries, and issues related to coastal and climate change. Over the last decade, he's authored many studies on economic development, job quality, and occupational segregation, and place-based inequality. He's currently leading projects focused on climate equity and the link between flooding and migration. And so I will now turn it over to our first speaker, Kim Marisek.
Okay. Thank you, Joni, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us in this Supporting Our Places and People as Climate Impacts Drive Population Movement, a session on managed retreat. So this slide didn't come out all the way it was supposed to, but Joni mentioned we work with the Center for Planning Excellence, which is a Louisiana-based nonprofit planning organization. We strive to help communities by working on planning initiatives across multiple scales of government. We work with the state to help think through policy and governance initiatives. We work with local communities to help them address comprehensive planning issues. And we also work with small neighborhood-based community planning efforts. But all of the work we do is underscored by our desire to help strengthen local communities and to help them enhance their quality of place while ensuring that they have access to the data and considerations around climate, health, and the equity challenges that we face here in Louisiana. And speaking of Louisiana, where we work solely only in Louisiana, which I believe is a culture and culinary leader in the country, and culture and strong ties to community and family are among the many reasons why Louisianians stay and why so many return to this place if they leave. But it's because of the unique heritage in Louisiana that we work to ensure that our children can continue to enjoy this wonderful place while we work on this critical issue of managed retreat and why it's so important that we get it right. So while we're talking about, sorry about that. So we are talking about managed retreat, and for the purposes of this conversation today, we're defining that as the purposeful coordinated movement of people and assets out of harm's way. And this has primarily occurred through federal funded buyout programs, with over 40,000 residential buyouts having occurred, and nearly all of them in response to riverine and coastal flooding and moving people out of purchasing their high-risk properties. We may also hear the terms planned, adaptive, or strategic retreat used in the same way, or if you don't like the word retreat, we may hear this referred to as relocation or resettlement, which we know can be culturally or historic problematic terms. And we may also hear about it in terms of managed realignment. So why are we talking about it if there's a federal program and people are using it? Well, it's because we know the need outstrips current demand, and the existing programs and approaches are unlikely to be able to scale to meet the needs of climate change. We already have $1.4 trillion of real estate located within 700 feet of the US coastline. Sea level rise alone is projected to affect 4 to 13 million Americans. And if just 1/10 of these people or buildings retreated, it would cost $140 billion, almost 30 times what the US has spent on managed retreat to date, and affect 5 to 10 times as many people. We are talking about it because it's hard to talk about, it's hard to think about, and it's hard to act on. It's not what we're used to. We're used to rebuilding after events. The US flood management has historically focused on enabling people and infrastructure to remain in risky areas, resisting floods with walls and levees, adding sand to eroding beaches, or elevating homes to avoid rising tides. There are concerns about equity. The US coast is the playground for the wealthy and home to some of the most disadvantaged and historically marginalized populations in the nation. So we have to figure out how to allow for a fairer process that supports the people who are most at risk. And there are strong psychological barriers that compete with the concept of home and community and sense of place. And even if individuals and communities are successfully able to talk about it, it's difficult to implement because there are limited authorities to act. We have strong values around private property rights. There are strong disincentives. Those with the power to engage in managed retreat, residents, local and state governments, real estate industry have financial incentives to remain in place. And there are whole communities with dense economic activities on at-risk coasts. And finally, there's no owner. The risk is shared across the community and responsibility for decision-making is fragmented. So why manage retreat if individuals are free to make their own decisions? Well, it's the most effective and cost-effective way to minimize risk. Individuals, as Joni mentioned in the opening remarks, they retreat all the time from risk. They move to places that come with lower insurance costs, lower transportation costs, better schools, and they self-select to identify places that alleviate unacceptable circumstances in their home. And it's still going to occur without management, but there will be significant costs. People will simply leave if they're able to shoulder the burden of relocation themselves. And we can see this already happening in places where more affluent and younger households move, leaving an aging and poorer population behind, which makes running government harder with shrinking tax bases and a higher burden on needed services. If we don't manage it locally, the responsibility will fall on the federal government. And currently there is a strong reliance on federal dollars, which may not always be available. And we think locally, we can enter into these community conversations when we're not in a crisis. But we know managed retreat will not be the appropriate answer everywhere. Some places will still build walls and levees or need to elevate, but places that retreat will need support. And the support can be best delivered at the local level and not left entirely to the federal dollars, which may be difficult to tailor to local conditions and needs. We see an ever-increasing need for managed retreat in those conversations in Louisiana, where we are experiencing a death by 1,000 cuts. And I know we're not alone in Louisiana with these particular challenges. We feel it because we live here, but it's not just climate change and sea level related increasing homeowners and flood insurance costs, and perhaps even the unavailability to attain homeowners insurance, the loss of public and private institutions, schools, libraries, grocery stores, doctors' offices, the impacts from population loss, again, the higher need for services and lowering tax bases, and most importantly, or more importantly, or as importantly, a loss of the social networks, informal support groups, and community ties that disintegrate as people move. So how does planning manifest? How does managed retreat manifest in community planning? And we hear about these issues disguised in terms like the cost of affordable housing, closing factories, job losses, decreasing tax revenues, and closing of community facilities like schools. But also in a robust planning process, we can help to design and build safe and resilient spaces, prioritize the quality of place and social services, and create a platform for community voices. And as planners, we are well positioned to set the table to hold these community-driven dialogues around managed retreat, because we understand that these conversations must be community-led. And so I want to pivot for just a second. I know Chief Sherrill is going to talk a lot about this project, but I wanted to just set the table a little bit for her. Because with some funding from the Foundation for Louisiana, CPEX has been able to enter into a partnership with the Grand Caillou Dulac band of Biloxi-Chitimacha-Choctaw tribe, and to go through a planning process with that community to really help them think through some of these bigger conversations about what it means to stay and what it means to leave their community. But the overarching goal is to co-develop a community-led resilient strategy focusing on building capacity within the tribe that will support their ability to recover from disasters while creating long-term resilient strategies. And we hope that this process will connect the tribe's vision for their future to the resources they currently need to provide safer, more resilient housing options, as well as continue to meet their needs for social cohesion, access to economic stability, and cultural preservation, which they have clearly stated are key factors for them. We're in the very early stages of this planning process, but I wanted to highlight for a minute the community engagement process that we've started, because we spent a lot of time on the front end designing the scope of work with the tribe and also how we're going to engage in this process, because we want to make sure we get it right. So we've set up a model that's a little bit different than our typical engagement process, where we would have a steering committee. In this particular instance, we've really thought a lot about creating what a cohort looks like for the tribe that will follow us through this entire planning process. First, initially with us to help us gain some information about what their historic needs are, their lived experience, their challenge, their future desires. But then as we're going through the process, helping to use that qualitative information that we've gathered along with the quantitative data analysis that we're compiling right now to really help chart a course for the tribe to build these conversations out in a meaningful way, and to really ensure that we're leaning into the lived experience of the tribe, both through the process of identifying concerns, but also in developing strategies and bringing in experts to help build capacity within the tribe. And our expectation then is those experts will also pay attention to the lived experience of the community, so that we are in a two-way learning environment throughout this entire process. And I think, it was really interesting for me as a planner to go through this process in a little bit different way. We went through and spoke with the tribe about what was important, who were important folks for them to talk to. And we really outlined, tribal members, folks who are there, people in the tribe who have moved away, but also importantly, the non-tribal members who live in that community that they consider to be family. And so, and I know the chief will speak more about this. We are just in the very beginning of this planning process and hope to complete it within about a year. But with that, Chief Sorrell, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will pull up your slides for you.
Everyone, of course, I am Sherelle Parfait-Dardar. I currently serve as the elder chief of the Grand Caillou Dulac band. We are Biloxi-Chitimacha-Choctaw people and live here in coastal Louisiana and been here since time immemorial. As you can see, there's some of the images from our community down in Grand Caillou Dulac. And of course, that's our beautiful tribal emblem there that was so wonderfully created by one of our tribal citizens. Next slide, Kim. Okay, so of course, Grand Caillou Dulac is a small, predominantly indigenous community in Terrebonne Parish. The population was around 2,458 at the 2000 census, and it's a part of the Houma Bayou Cane Thibodaux Metropolitan Statistical Area. And you can see on the map there, what the area actually looks like from overhead. Next slide. So of course, every day our tribe struggles to preserve our homeland culture and identity. As a result of severe environmental changes brought on by oil and gas exploration, erosion, saltwater intrusion, and climate change, our ancestors' tradition and cultural practices are becoming significantly less sustainable. We lose on average 1 football field of land every 100 minutes. Next slide. Our tribe still continues to live off the land and water to the best of our ability. Look, anybody can tell you, right? You come to Louisiana, you're going to eat the food, right? And seafood's the best. One of my very first jobs was working in the shrimp factory, Salmonese packing. Some of the best times I've ever had, working with our people in an industry that we're very familiar with. Those bountiful resources have been steadily declining over the years, due to a lot of the impacts that we face, but we're still working actively to try to protect and preserve what we have. Next slide. Land erosion and saltwater intrusion. As you look at the images here, and you'll see what we call skeleton trees, right? That's where salt water is starting to come in. It's affecting the roots, and the trees are dying, right? Because they can't handle the salinity. We were very fortunate a couple of years ago to have Chief Devon, who's our current active chief, who attended Williams College, really did a good study on how much land loss the tribal areas were experiencing in comparison to other areas. That's data that we really had not had before. We knew we were losing land at an astronomical rate in comparison to some other areas, but we really didn't know how much. So a lot of thanks to him and Williams College for taking all of that information and putting it together in something that we could actually show and utilize. So basically you can see the top picture is, which is the map on the right that shows the land and water proportions in 1998. And then the one right below it shows it in 2020. That's a huge, huge difference in the amount of land loss that we've experienced in just that short amount of time. Next slide. Tropical storms, hurricanes, and flooding. Something that we are very, very familiar with here in Louisiana, especially on the coast. But we don't just deal with flooding from hurricanes and tropical storms. At one time, we didn't experience it, what we called random flooding. Now we do. So anytime we get a southerly wind, lower parts of the community will experience random flooding for several days. So hurricane flooding is not an exception. The random events disrupt our ability to maintain gardens and small livestock, as well as our traditional practices. And of course, due to global warming, global climate models predict hurricanes will likely cause more intense rainfall and have an increased coastal flood risk due to higher storm surge caused by rising seas. And we are physically experiencing those things right now. We can see them, as you can see in the pictures. Those are not from hurricanes. Those are from southeasterly winds pushing the tides in. And unfortunately, we have an aging population. So it's our elders that are stuck in their homes in these waters for days. Next slide, please. Protection. So we have what's called the Morganza to the Gulf Hurricane Protection System. That is a huge levee, lock, and floodgate system designed to provide 100-year Category 3 storm surge protection. The Morganza will continue to protect us from hurricane, storm surge, and flooding if it's maintained correctly, but not from random flooding events, saltwater intrusion, or erosion. So mind you, this is designed to protect from a Category 3 storm. Hurricane Ida, that devastated many of our communities, was almost a Cat 5. And those are things that we're expected to see more frequently, okay? More intense storms, we're expected to see them rapidly intensify, and not really having a set idea on where exactly it's going to make landfall. Those things are getting a little harder to predict. You know, so it is concerning who is in position of authority for these areas, because we really need them to understand how serious it is to continue to maintain this Morganza hurricane protection system, right? Because it did work for Ida in our area, but it did get damaged. Now our parish president, who is currently still seated, moved very quickly to get it repaired and get it back into place for the rest of storm season. But we really need to ensure that all of our leaders coming in are going to understand how serious this is. Next slide, please. Relocation possibilities. With climate-induced displacement on the rise, relocation is something that we are forced to realistically consider. At present, there is no dedicated funding, dedicated lead agency, or dedicated policy framework to guide communities in need of relocation. It's common for coastal communities to rely on federal and state money to rebuild. However, federal policy does not support community-led relocation efforts and planning, right? And we're hoping that that changes, right? That's what we're all doing here today. That's what our amazing work moving forward with CPEX has been about. And we're really, really excited about what the future is going to bring. Next slide, please. Canal backfilling project. So look, we're not just sitting around saying, what are we going to do, right? We have always been an adapting people. We have always been a resilient people. We're not patting ourselves on the back for that word because it's exhausting, okay? But we are familiar with these things. So a lot of the times we will take the lead and try to implement projects that we are able to get implemented on our own. The canal backfilling project is one of those. So, of course, over the past century, extractive energy industries have dug more than 35,000 canals in Southeast Louisiana, resulting in 10,000 miles of disrupted wetlands. More than 3/4 of these canals are no longer in use. However, they were not filled back in. And you can see in the diagram there up above, you know, what those look like, right? You have open canals and canals that have been filled back in. Backfilling restores wetland, prevents future wetland loss, and is highly cost effective. the distribution of oil and gas well permits issued between 1900 and 2017 that were plugged or abandoned in 2017 and on land in the 14 parishes. And that's that image at the bottom where you see all the little dots, right? So we have been actively working on canal backfilling. We have to work with private landowners to get permissions. And we are partnered with the Lowlander Center, First Peoples Conservation Council of Louisiana, and Dr. Eugene Turner from LSU. So that has been a very fruitful project. It's, again, very cost effective and it's nature-based, right? We are utilizing nature to help heal the damage that we've caused. And it does show to be very cost effective. And those are things that we want to keep trying to implement, right? Because those are things that we can get done that are very natural, no to very little negative impact to the environment, because we don't want to cause more damage than what we've already done, right? That's the goal. Don't cause any more harm. You know, and hopefully we can continue to protect and preserve the area while we're working on different ideas to either have to resettle in another location, or hopefully, you know, if these projects are successful, maybe we can safely remain in place. Next slide. We are all in this together. And I say this time and time again, we were not put on this planet alone, right? If Creator would have wanted that, it would have been so. But we have over 7 billion people on the planet, and we are extremely diverse, right? And we're facing very diverse challenges. So what does that tell us? It's in our diversity that we are going to be able to solve these very diverse challenges that we're dealing with today. You know, and a lot of my favorite saying is the earth did not belong to man, man belongs to the earth. All things are connected, like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life. He's merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. Of course, that's quoted from Chief Seattle of Squamish and Duwamish nations. And I think that's the end of our slides, Kim. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think it's my turn now, so I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my own slides. Please bear with me for a second. Okay, can somebody give me a thumbs up? Can you see that? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm actually going to shift frames a little bit and give a little bit more of like a population level view on mobility with a focus in Louisiana. So again, my name is Robbie Habens. I'm the economist at the data center in New Orleans. We are an independent nonprofit research organization and data intermediary, and our mission is to provide data and information relevant to the most important challenges facing our region and our state. And everything that we're talking about today certainly qualifies for that. So managed retreat. This calls to mind population mobility on a scale not yet seen. However, it also calls to mind old questions about the process of residential location, about place-based inequality, whether that's in terms of access to economic opportunity or exposure to environmental hazards, and about whether policy should focus on investing in places or on people, meaning that their mobility should be encouraged. And from a research perspective, it turns out that migration and mobility responses to coastal climate and environmental change are really difficult to pin down as a concept or as something that we can measure. And basically that's because people move for a lot of reasons that are unrelated to environmental hazards. Also, frankly, our data on migration is not very rich, let alone our ability to forecast it far out into the future on a scale that's relevant for planning. And that's, again, all the more reason to heed firsthand experiences in qualitative research on migration. Nonetheless, the question of how much is a critical one for planning in both frontline and receiving areas, for providing services and infrastructure, and for assessing equity and efficiency in the distribution of costs and benefits, all of which falls under our topic today of managing environmental transitions. So I'll talk through a bit of trends in Louisiana for a few minutes, from the context of trying to quantify environmental migration. And then I'm going to hit on how we're trying to tackle some of these questions in ongoing research, with the usual caveat that this is a work in progress and all subject to change. And with that, I'll start showing some maps and data. So where better to start with that than with 2000 census data, because it's the most complete count of the population that's available, and because it's relatively new. So between 2010 and 2020, Louisiana's population rose by 2.7%. However, as our local media has been very fond of pointing out, population had grown relatively stagnant by the end of the decade. And as a result, you can see on this map that the number of places in our state that gained population were fairly limited, and mostly in the suburbs of South Louisiana's metro areas. And if we compare these population trends with projections of flood risk, such as these that come from First Street Foundation, we can surely see that many of the places experiencing the most intense flood risk also lost population. However, really the dominant trend here is that population loss was in rural Louisiana. And in fact, North Louisiana in many cases lost more population than the coastal region. So with a retreating population, we might expect to see population moving northward. However, the mean center of population in the state of Louisiana had moved southward since 2010. And it's at its southernmost point since 1880, when the very first estimate of where the mean center is located is available. So conventional data on migration, although it is relatively sparse, as I said, suggests that people are leaving coastal parishes and tend to move either to neighboring parishes or to these growing areas. And though many of these areas lie further inland from the coast and have less exposure to storm surge and sea level rise, they are, however, in many cases still vulnerable to inland river flooding, as shown on this map. And that all brings me to the complexity of migration, which has already been mentioned a couple of times. So I want to highlight a few additional trends. Okay, I'm gonna pick up where I left off, unless somebody tells me otherwise, and just give the very abbreviated version in the interest of time. Okay, so here we go. Okay, I'm gonna skip over this. Basically, the economy is very important to population change. The rate at which people have been moving over time has been declining. It's at a historic low over the past 70 years. That's true in Louisiana, just like it's true in the nation as a whole. In addition, the supply of housing is growing increasingly constrained because we're building housing at the slowest rate in decades as well. So all of that is to say, if there is a mass migration of people, where are people going to go? So that was kind of my setup for, again, which we've already hit on, how complex migration is. And then all that to kind of set up this research project that we have going on right now. So I'm going to spend the remaining few minutes talking about that. So our project on coastal population mobility is motivated by the state of Louisiana's coastal master plan. This is a plan that's updated every 6 years to prioritize the spending of $50 billion over a 50-year time frame on protecting and restoring the coast of Louisiana. And this plan has tons of amazing models that predict storm surge, flood risk, and land loss decades into the future that covers all of coastal Louisiana. However, there to date has not been as much of an emphasis on social sciences or the important role of population dynamics in long-term planning. So our study that we put together is intending to measure the effects of flood risk and flood events on migration outcomes, flows of people, and employment trends in the past, focusing on a period roughly since 2000, and to explore the implications for forecasting future population and economic change under increasing risk, frequency, and severity of flooding and other coastal hazards. And we think that this kind of information is especially important in settings like the Coastal Master Plan. However, there's a variety of other planning settings, which I'm sure we'll talk about in discussion, and which we've heard about already, where this kind of information is relevant. So very briefly, conventional data on migration is very limited. We get better and better information about risk to flooding and other coastal hazards, yet what we get from the Census Bureau is not really well matched in either time or geography to the way that these kinds of hazards are actually experienced. So what our project is built around is using essentially a marketing data set that allows us to measure address changes with a high degree of detail over time. And with this kind of information, we can look at migration responses to flood events. And here, just for example, we've used Hurricane Katrina, which obviously is an exceptional case. And this is moves out of Orleans Parish that's measured almost immediately after Hurricane Katrina. We see a 6,000% increase in moves out of the parish. And likewise, on the right, this is the 2016 floods, which was another major flood event that affected much of South Louisiana. We see not as large, but still a fairly significant spike in moves away. Just to give a little bit more intuition for the study, this again stays with the 2016 floods. The highlighted census tracts are areas that experienced a claims event from the National Flood Insurance Program, and the areas in yellow had intensified rates of people moving out of their homes as measured by address changes within these tracts. But not only can we see where people are moving from, but we're also able to look at where people are moving to. And the areas in yellow are places that had an excess of address changes to those locations within a few months after the 2016 floods. So that's kind of the intuition for the study. What we're really trying to do is to generalize this across the last 20 years and across all of coastal Louisiana. And so that allows us to estimate excess residential address changes by month for census tracts exposed to flooding over the last 2 decades. And what we find is that there is this measurable spike in address changes almost immediately after flood events, which suggests that the rate at which people are moving out of affected areas is about 20% higher than it would have been otherwise, which is not maybe the hugest effect that we would expect, but do note that we've removed Hurricane Katrina from this average simply because it skews the averages so high. So this includes the 2016 floods. It includes more typical flood events over the last 20 years as well. But if we can measure the effect on moves, we can also look at the destination of those moves. And here we're looking at the destinations of moves from Orleans Parish after Hurricane Katrina. And it's mostly consistent with those of us who experienced it and with all the research that was done on Hurricane Katrina. A lot of people moved to other parts of Louisiana, to other southern metro areas like Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, and Baton Rouge. And if we compare this to, again, all the other flood events over the last 20 years, Hurricane Katrina truly was exceptional. What we are finding is that in most cases after flood events, people tend to move to places where they were moving already. So this is consistent with the idea that natural disasters, in most cases, have the effect of intensifying pre-existing trends. And that again means a lot of people moving to the places of Louisiana that are already growing, or moving out of state to other southern regions that are also growing. And this is very preliminary, but this is what we're intending to spend a lot of our time on with the study, is to look at the effects of floods on different communities. So here we've kind of teased out different effects for communities that are predominantly renters and predominantly low and moderate income communities. And we see that the rates of moving out of those communities after flood are a little bit higher. So we're intending to kind of do this, slice it as many ways as we can to get a better understanding of who is affected and to what extent, looking again at past floods with the intention of informing our expectations about future flood events. So I'll close with just a few implications. This kind of information does have implications for infrastructure and adaptation planning. I mentioned the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. This also, I think, has a lot of implications for other regional planning settings. So every one of our regional planning organizations in South Louisiana has a focus on resiliency in their built environment. Yet, to my knowledge, none of them are taking into account expected population migration from intensified flood risk. Yet, much like our state coastal planning agency, these organizations do population forecasting every few years for the purposes of prioritizing infrastructure. So in some ways, it's different infrastructure investments, but kind of a similar problem. And something else that we've been working on that I think is ultimately very related to this is measuring equity outcomes. There's been a huge focus on this over the past few years, particularly with Justice 40 and some of the other directives coming out of the federal government. There's been this kind of proliferation of screening tools that are designed to assess the equity impacts of infrastructure investments for the intention of prioritizing the benefits of those investments toward the most vulnerable and most disadvantaged communities. But today it's a very difficult thing to measure something like benefit, but it's very much focused on a very static notion of place when we should expect this more dynamic notion of population, and also, the exposure of an individual or of a community to some kind of harm or benefit is not strictly determined by data on the people who live in a community. I'm sure we can go into more of that in the comments if we have time. And then the last thing, and we mentioned it at the beginning, but planning for housing and planning for economic development also have huge implications for managed retreat. I think if we don't figure out how to build more housing, make our housing more resilient, and have more affordable housing especially, that will be what causes chaotic responses in receiving communities. And also, again, thinking about the regional economy, at a very local level, shifts in population can put communities into a downward spiral in terms of their economy and sort of like the fiscal health of those communities, but also with a focus on our regional economies and our statewide economy in Louisiana. We're a bit exceptional among states in that we rank near the top in income inequality and in carbon or GHG emissions per capita, which means that our state really needs to go through this process of transitioning our economy. And if we're going to think about managed retreat, we are also compelled to think about a just transition at the exact same time, because it's my opinion that economic factors have been and will continue to be the driving factor in population migration for the immediate future. So yeah, apologize again for all the technological snafus. I swear my computer just decided to shut down for no particular reason, and then it came back on like nothing happened in the first place. I don't know what's going on. We need to have words, but thanks for bearing with me.
Yeah, thanks for rejoining, Robbie. You made it worth the wait. And I think your closing comments bringing together, some of the looking forward to economic shifts and preparing for those and thinking about how to incorporate equity into that planning process, I think is a really nice way of tying together Kim and Chief Sherrell's earlier presentations too, into a kind of teeing us up for a great conversation. And so I'm not exactly sure how the Q&A works. I think that there are folks who I haven't seen any questions in the Zoom chat, but there may be questions in the app that folks are using to participate in the conference. And then I know there are real physical people in a room. So if any of you have questions, please line up and we'll have someone there to facilitate that. But I'll start off with a question and then we can kind of see if there are any others to follow. So I'd like to start, I think, by talking about policy. We've talked a good bit about planning and sort of how to design a planning process that addresses all of the community level needs that we've brought up, and perhaps even regional planning activities. But we also know that policy plays an important role in kind of guiding how successful those planning activities can be, and also how successful they can be in implementation. And so I'd love to hear from each of you, what new policy or policy amendments would have the biggest impact in supporting the migration of people from vulnerable Louisiana communities. Kim, it sounded like Kim nominated Chief Sherrell to go first, but if you don't want to, we can get Kim to go.
No, I'm happy to go first on this one. So we are in a particularly interesting situation when it comes to policy, right? And it's, first of all, we're tribal people, Okay, so the policy that's going to work for a non-tribal community that's facing, which we use the term resettlement, right? It's what we're most comfortable with. But, like I said, the policy that would move a non-tribal community is not going to be the same policy that's going to move a tribal community, right? Tribal communities are very unique, especially tribes that are pursuing or have federal acknowledgement, right? That's a process all in itself. And those policies have been revised twice in the 27 years that we've been petitioning, right? So it's ever evolving. One of the criteria in order to achieve federal acknowledgement says that you must have a certain percentage of your tribal citizens within your set jurisdiction, right? And if you fall below that percentage, then you don't meet that particular criteria and you don't get federal acknowledgement. Also, just because a tribe achieves federal acknowledgement does not mean that they can keep it, right? You're constantly monitored. So if your population dwindles down to where it's almost non-existent below their required amount, you can lose your federal status. And the only way to get it back is to go through Congress, right? Which we've seen how that goes. It doesn't, so those things need to be taken into consideration anytime you need to resettle communities, right? First of all, we need to understand the community itself. How is this community identified? What is their history? What is their culture, right? How big is this community? How many people are we talking about? Is it an aging population? You have to have all of that information, and policy needs to reflect that, right? Like, okay, if we're gonna be doing this talk, these are the things that we need to be considering, which is a human aspect, something that we really haven't seen in a lot of policy, right? And there's that social aspect. I know that most policy focuses on cost, right? And, all of these different criteria that they look at, economics and risk factors. But what we're not seeing is that human aspect that's in there. Like, what is this community comprised of, right? What makes them unique and what's the best way for us to serve them? Whether that would be for them to adapt in place if they still have that option, right? How can we invest in this community so that they can be resilient in the environment that they're currently in and well into the future? And we know that there are ways to do that, right? It's just that we haven't really been seeing them being implemented. And I think it's because a lot of these concepts are still trying to get their footing, right? On how to do this the right way. So we do understand. But a lot of the times policy falls very short when it comes to indigenous and tribal communities, right? And that's one of the things that we really need to see changing, because that's one of the first barriers that they throw up in the front of our community in particular. When we approach them and say, okay, we're facing this challenge, we need to access resources so that we can, help the community. Well, you're not federal, right? That's one of the first things they throw out in the front of us. Well, we've only been going through it for 27 years. If you'd stop changing the rules, maybe we could get there. So, and we have an active treaty, okay? Like, we have an active treaty, and even that's complicated. So a lot of those things need to be addressed on the policy level for communities like ours, right? Not just ours, but all communities. Again, because we're not looking at that human aspect, that social aspect that each community has as their identity, their culture, right? Their practice. And we don't want to lose any community if we're having to resettle them, right? So how can policy start to really look at those things, right? In a very open and honest way, so that we are really helping these communities to adapt and remain resilient, and just doing what the community actually needs to do, right? Like, we really need to start looking at the community as a whole. And we just haven't reached that point yet. So that's what I'm hoping to see some changes in.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting the additional challenges that tribal communities face, in addition to all of the other challenges that we just outlined that every community faces. That's so important to keep that at the forefront. Robbie, did you have any thoughts or perhaps insights on how some of the work that you're doing or conclusions that you've come to might be in some way integrated into policy development?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to. So, and I'll just issue these words with the caution that at the data center, we try to stay away from policy recommendations and just focus on the data. But yeah, I really take Sherelle's words to heart, which is focusing on the community as a whole and kind of like the, more relational view of these problems. I mean, I tend to think that in some ways the best policy is the really general policy and the best policy in other areas, which is diversifying the economy and building affordable housing, because like ultimately that's going to create headwinds for any kind of orderly resettlement or migration of people, even if we kind of do the planning part really well. But just in terms of doing the planning part really well, and this is maybe just something I'm kind of reacting to in the response so far in the earlier presentations. But the way Kim framed her one note in her presentation was the impending huge expense of managed retreat, and I think you said $140 billion. Which was 10 times more than we've spent on it. And then what Chief Sherelle just mentioned, which is that tribal communities and non-tribal communities might have different policy solutions because the context is very different. And I think that lesson there is that we have a lot of different communities and their solutions will be very different because communities are individuals. So I think that in some ways this is like one of the main policy issues is like, yeah, like at the same time we need to support communities in their specific needs. And we kind of need to figure out how to like scale up the solution at the same time, which means kind of like replicating lessons that we're learning from some of these projects, like the partnership that was discussed earlier. But that to me is almost like the really big policy challenge, is kind of doing the specific part and scaling it up at the same time.
Did you have an answer?
I mean, I think you guys both hit on where I was intending to go, because my experience is really grounded in local planning. And so I feel like that's the best place to start these conversations, is to really make sure local communities understand and have a good understanding about what their risk is and what their opportunities are. But I also do hope that we look to the state for some guidance on some broad policy directives that can help shepherd those local conversations along. And so I feel like really the policy solution is to figure out how to better integrate the federal opportunities, the state goals for kind of climate related decisions, and then really creating some sort of umbrella with local communities so that they can lever up to what the state's outlining in terms of their broader policies and initiatives, which that would be my hope.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple questions in the chat from Lisa Webster. It looks like the first one is for Robbie. Have you published this data yet? And Lisa'd like to learn more about the methods of tracking address changes post-flooding. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that methodology?
No, we haven't published it yet. We're kind of in the late stages of our research project, so we should expect to have like real releases of this coming out in the fall. maybe we can figure out how to get in touch offline. And I'd be happy to share more about the study. And there's a lot more going on in terms of the methods than I've hinted on here and the data. So I'm happy to talk about that more.
And then we also have a question for Chief Sherrill. Looks like another question from Lisa, who seems like is in Hawaii. What do we do when there's not enough space to move an entire community together to a new location? It's the challenge that they're facing in Hawaii. Do you have any thoughts there?
So, as an individual who has been actively looking for land, right? And, to have enough space for our community should we have to resettle and to be able to grow, right, as well. I mean, look, we're going to need room for businesses, room for many things. What we're not finding is enough land to do that. And that's going to be across the board. So one of the things that we've considered is a term that we've heard, it's called satellite communities, right? It's where you have groups of your people that can move, maybe not exactly into the same vicinity as each other, right? So for example, our jurisdiction, hold on one second.
Another cliffhanger. Another cliffhanger, but while she's gone, I think the last question that I wanted to pose to the group was about hope. Oh, Chief Sherrill's back, so here we go.
I do apologize. There was someone knocking at the door. We got that. So yes, like I was saying, in our jurisdiction right now, we're basically in two cities, right? We have these bayou communities stick out like fingers. So we have the community of Grand Caillou, Dulac, but we also have the community of Chauvin, which is where I currently live. And we usually go between those communities. So in understanding that way of living, right? And knowing that we've always still gone back and forth, we've always still interacted, that kind of put a little hope in my heart to say, okay, maybe we might not be able to find a large enough parcel of land to bring everyone into. But what if we can find smaller parcels of land to stay within close proximity to each other, similar like what we have now? It really comes down to a point of being creative, right? And crossing your fingers and putting up lots of prayers that you can find these things, because we're not the only people that are facing these challenges. We're really not, and as these things continue to happen, land is going to become more and more scarce. That's just our reality. So for us, we've had to get very creative. And in looking at our history, right, kind of gave us a little bit of an idea of what maybe we could do to still stay in close proximity to each other, even if we're not within the same property, sort of speak. Now, I don't know if we're going to be able to make that happen. Again, the biggest parcel of land we found was almost 2 hours away, right? And that's a very drastic move for your people. I mean, you're literally leaving everything that but those are the types of solutions that we've had to look towards, and being very realistic at what our future may look like if we have to reset.
So it looks like we've got one other question in the chat that just came through. Perhaps this is a good question for Robbie. Since managed retreat has always been a voluntary process, do projected relocation costs go up the longer people wait? Dive into that question.
Yeah, I don't know that I feel just because my job title is economist that I have a monopoly on the answer to this question. I certainly think that makes sense. I mean, do projected location costs go up the longer people wait? I don't know. I mean, I actually might think that people with more on the ground experience might be a little bit better positioned to answer that question. I think, you know, it depends on, when I see costs, I think costs for whom, and maybe that's kind of the question about if it's a voluntary process, or it presumably at some point, if you waited a long time, it ceases to be voluntary, and then that might imply, you know, a different sort of way of sort of set up for the cost question.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Oh gosh, guys, thank you for bearing with us. So unless anybody else has thoughts to follow up on that question, I'd love to just spend a couple minutes. I know we've got 4 minutes left. I'd love to ride that wave of creativity and optimism that Chief Sherrill started, and just ask, you know, how do you see the future? Are you hopeful? And if so, what are the things that inspire that hope?
I'll go ahead and start, Joni. I am hopeful for the future, and I'm most hopeful particularly because I've seen the shift at the federal level to incorporate climate and equity into so many big infrastructure investment projects, and that has become, you know, a more important part of funding decisions. And so I think that those signal a shift, at least in the near term, for local communities needing to consider these bigger questions, these bigger policy shifts and questions as they're thinking about the future for their own investment. So that gives me hope.
Yeah, I'll second that with Kim. I think that there's a lot to be positive about, just in terms of the way that these conversations have changed at the federal level, and even like a little bit at the state level to an extent. But you know, I think that just the reality of our political situation and the way that we're kind of thinking about this is like, you know, local, regional, state, federal, and all the different levels. A lot of that hope can also be very tenuous. Maybe just as a data guy, the part that I am attracted to is that I think that this is a very uncertain set of questions that we face, but on some level, I think it's impossible to be hopeful without some being comfortable with uncertainty, because it's only through uncertainty that we can actually change for the better. So yeah, we're all here and interested in this and having questions. So I think there's enough to find hope in there.
Always hopeful, right? I'm a mother, and you know, looking just at my children, and looking at, you know, the future generations, which they're our present, right? Everything that we do and everything we don't do is going to affect our future generations. And I've really been inspired by, like Kim and Rob pointed out, right? We're seeing changes, right, happening. And it may not be as quickly as we want or had hoped, but the fact of the matter is people are seeing, right, what's happening, and they're also starting to wake up and say, okay, we really need to do something here. You know, and just really sitting back and seeing the changes that are happening, seeing how people's mindsets are changing, and they're being more inclusive and, you know, more caring and kind. And we got a lot of good people out there, and they want to do good things, right? And I think that we're going to be able to do that. It's going to be tricky, it's going to be confusing, it's going to be a lot of things, but I don't see any reason to give up on my hope, because I see a lot of good things coming forward. So just really think.
What a lovely way to end our session. So thanks to all three of our panelists for sharing their perspectives and expertise and time. And also thanks to all of you for sticking around through all of our tech issues and yeah, sticking around to the end. So thanks everybody. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.